From Hamilton Place Strategies in Washington, D.C., this is the HPS Insights podcast.
Welcome to HPS Insights, a podcast from Hamilton Place Strategies analyzing the current events impacting the business and political communities. I'm your host, Bryan and DeAngelis, a managing director here at HPS. And today I have the pleasure to interview a good friend of mine, Dan Cox. Dan is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and the founder and director of the Survey Center on American Life. He's here to discuss his recent American Perspective survey, Conspiracy Theories, Misinformation, COVID-19, and the 2020 election. Dan, thanks for joining us on HPS Insights.
Yeah, delighted to be here.
We have a lot to talk about, Dan. I spent hours last night reading through your report again, and I have way too many questions for the time we have. But before I jump into all of that, tell us a little bit about your work at AEI and the work of the Survey Center on American Life.
Sure. Yeah, we're relatively new on the scene. So we officially launched just about a month and a half ago. But it's work I've been doing in one form or other my entire career. So starting at the Pew Research Center, then going and co-founding a Public Religion Research Institute, which is now PRI, and then coming to AEI a couple of years ago and starting this new center. And sort of the thread that connects all that work is really conducting, high quality public opinion research to help people make sense of this really complicated world we live in. And so what we're doing at the Survey Center is we're tackling some of these big important questions that relate to the way Americans live their lives. And we really want to get a good sense of understanding how people are living their lives, sort of getting on the ground experiences. And a lot of pollsters tend to ask the public questions about topics they haven't really thought much about, and that can be valuable. But we really want to ask questions of respondents that they actually, things that they care about. So the job situation, that what's going on in their community, in their neighborhood, what's going on in their family, in their personal lives. We did a poll earlier this year on the politics of dating. So people trying to get a sense of how much politics was sort of interceding and shaping the dating decisions and romantic decisions. And so that's the kind of thing that we do, and it's a little bit different than you may see from other public polling outfits. And what we do and the sort of function we serve is not that dissimilar to places like the Pew Research Center or Gallup. And it's trying to, again, explain what's going on, but it's not just producing facts, it's explaining them. So, when I get a call from a journalist or reporter, and there's I would say our audience includes journalists, but also public policymakers and nonprofit and business leaders as well. And we really want to help them understand not just what the number is, but why we see what we do. And we're really service oriented in that way. And our goal is to help reporters and others understand not only what is going on in American households around the country, but why.
Right. And if I may say, I assume what's changing, and we're going to talk about conspiracy theories and the importance they are now having in our American life. But I think if we did this podcast 5 years ago, that wouldn't be true. We weren't all heading into a Thanksgiving where we discuss election fraud and rigged elections and whatever we heard from Giuliani's crazy press conference the other day about Hugo Chavez. But this is literally becoming a very real part of American life and household discussions. And in my opinion, they're starting to undermine faith in our elections and democracy. So maybe let me start there. Why, in your view or from your research, are so many people gravitating to these conspiracy theories that seem to be so easily debunked?
Yeah, so we conducted a poll not too long ago that looked at conspiracies and misinformation. And it's important to remember that these kind of things have been going on for a long, long time. So, there have been folks who trafficking and this kind of stuff, whether it's birtherism, Obama was not born in the US. And there's a long history when you think about politics and public health. But what's different now is that you have what I would say is fairly large and reputable institutions kind of mainstreaming a lot of these things. the president of the United States, the Republican Party, sort of saying, "Oh yeah, there's a massive election fraud and Trump really won," coming from the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and that's new. That is something that we haven't seen. These things kind of operated on the fringes of the internet, places like 4chan and 8chan and Reddit and these other places where they serve as sort of fact-free environments. But now I think what you're having is people who are distrusting of institutions, whether it's civic institutions, political institutions, the media particularly, and they're saying, well, if I can't trust these sort of more traditional sources of information, where am I going to get my news and information about politics and public life? Well, I'm not going to rely perhaps on the crazy email from my uncle, but I'm going to go to these sites which already are sort of set up to provide me with the information that I want. These sort of social networking sites, whether it's Facebook or YouTube, and even Twitter.
Right. It strikes me that that's a little, if this makes sense, a little chicken and the egg, right? People are not trusting media, and so digging deeper into these conspiracy theories, but then it feels like media turns around and covers these conspiracy theories, which then just further fuels the conspiracy theories. Help us unpack that. Is that what you're finding as well?
Yeah, well, we've seen a really precipitous decline in public trust in a variety of institutions, government, media, Congress, even the military to some extent. And that's we've seen a sort of a long drop since the 70s, and then there's been some dips in the 80s and 90s too. So we're at historic lows. And some of this has been purposeful, right? Like a lot of more Republican and conservative politicians have purposefully attacked the media when it's been critical. And I think there are some valid criticisms that you can make of the media and the way it does, particularly covers politics. But I think that some of this has been self-serving, and you see a lot of that. And when we looked at our conspiracy work, one of the things we saw was that while it is more likely to manifest on the right than the left, it's on both sides. So we asked this question about whether people believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin had dirt on Donald Trump. And the majority of Democrats agreed that despite being no evidence for this, that this was something that was true. And then for Republicans, there's a variety of more sort of mainstream conspiracy theories that Trump has trafficked in that are believed, and one of them is voter fraud and electoral fraud. But again, Trump is not the first person to make these claims. The sort of like the claims of electoral fraud have been pretty prominent in the sort of conservative side of politics for a while.
Yeah, and I don't want to spend too much time on Trump. I'm personally ready to turn the page, but the big thing there is he does seem to be the first president, and that's had a huge influence. And I'm more curious on your take of whether that can be reversed. You've seen Biden try to take a much more serious approach. Candidates on the left could easily, like you said, kind of gin up their own conspiracy theories about things. And I think Biden's trying to play it very responsibly, in my opinion. Is that going to be effective at all to kind of reverse some of these beliefs?
I mean, he's not going to be able to do it alone for sure. And one of it, and I think it's something that many of my colleagues at AI are really interested in, is revitalizing institutions, right? We've got to build back trust. We got to build back social capital. We need a shared reality to get anything done. And so that's really, to me, one of the scariest things is that Trump has, his whole career, his whole life, he's created this sort of unique reality bubble for himself where facts can't penetrate. And he sort of brought that to the GOP in a way that I think has been really problematic and challenging for our political system. And so, you've seen in certain quarters of the Republican Party, people pushing back on that, sort of saying, no, this is ridiculous, this is false. These things that Trump's saying are not backed up by the evidence at all. And we'll sort of see in a post-Trump world, what happens. But, there's talk about Trump wanting to, possibly stay in the running for 2024. And I share your desire to like be done just talking about Trump all the time. But I think like he's going to try to keep himself as part of the conversation. And I for one was surprised, and perhaps I've been a little naive about how much of the Republican establishment is not at this point really said, no, we're done, right? We need to move on.
Right.
Biden won a free and fair election, but we're just not seeing that. There's only a few, I would say, establishment Republican figures that are really saying, yeah, Biden is president-elect. We need to sort of move on and have an orderly transition.
Yeah, and at least as of this recording, hopefully we're starting to see that change a little bit with, I saw Lamar Alexander came out today. We're recording on Friday, and Tucker Carlson last night. Was really quite astonishing to see Tucker Carlson pushing back on Giuliani in Powell's press conference. But I hope I'm not naive that this is starting to turn. Before we take a break, I'm wondering if you can, or hopefully you can shed a little bit of light on who are these conspiracists? Is it everybody from all demographics and age groups and education groups, or is it a growing or particular set of Americans that gravitate towards these on both sides of the aisle?
Yeah, I think, historically it's been people with less formal years of education, people who are more civically and socially disengaged, kind of people who are themselves operating at more of the margins of society. But on some of this stuff, we've seen that, education doesn't really actually play a huge role, particularly when we're talking about political conspiracies. So highly educated Republicans are not less likely to believe Obama was born outside the U.S. than lower educated Republicans. They're sort of have that belief similarly, and it's because it's politically motivated, and it's the sort of their ideological commitments that really are driving this stuff. And we see that a lot. And one of the things that we've looked at a lot is this idea of sort of reinforcing mechanisms. So how do the people around us, our sort of immediate social environment, influence our political attitudes? And a lot of us live in sort of political echo chambers in our immediate life, not even with the media we're consuming, but in our personal lives. Most of the people that we know and spend time with have political views that reflect our own. And that creates an environment where it's much more difficult to refute this stuff, because you're only hearing one side. So you're not hearing someone saying, no, that's ridiculous. And so that's something that I think we're really aware of. And this happens on both the left and the right, this kind of political self-sorting where we sort of gravitate towards people who share our political predispositions. And this is something that's increasing, right? We've always been socially segregated along lines of race and class and religion. But politics is something that I think is moving in the opposite direction, where while the rest of them were becoming sort of more integrated, more sort of diverse, politics were actually moving in the opposite direction, becoming sort of more stratified, more sort of self-selecting in these sort of homogeneous clusters. And that's happening with just friends, but also who we end up marrying too. Right.
I did promise to ask, I guess the place where that still gets mixed up a little bit is around the Thanksgiving dinner table, as folks maybe don't go home this year, but join their proverbial crazy uncle or something on Zoom. Any advice for debunking conspiracies that folks hear over the holidays?
Well, one of the great things about having a more diverse political network is that we're much more open to hearing the other side. And that's really, really important. We can understand where they're coming from, even if we don't agree. It provides a sense of like political legitimacy. So if my side loses, but I can understand the motivations and desires and interests of people who with different political views, I'm much more willing to accept these kind of, from my side, like a poor political outcome. And so that's really important. We also become a lot more flexible in our beliefs. So we're less likely to become sort of hardened political warriors, sort of, trying to win on our side. And I think that we need more of that, right? So I think I have this thing that I tell groups I talk to, we need to be arguing more about politics and not less. We just need to do it in a way that's respectful and engaging. But I think we shouldn't shy away from political differences. We should sort of seek out people who can challenge us a little bit. And yeah, sometimes we argue a little bit and it can make us uncomfortable, but ultimately that's part of living in a democratic free society. And we ought to be striving for that.
Yeah. And I think a big part of that is, as you said earlier, where we get our information. And I want to come back to that. Let's take a quick break, but then we'll come back and jump into a discussion about the media and the election and maybe where the polling industry is headed after 2020. You're listening to HPS Insights. We'll be right back.
Every 2 weeks, HPS measures U.S. adults' feelings and expectations for the economy. The HPS Civic Science Economic Sentiment Index accurately measures movements in overall national economic sentiment and provides a more sophisticated alternative to existing economic sentiment indices. To learn more, contact us through HamiltonPlaceStrategies.com.
We're back on HPS Insights. My guest today is Dan Cox, and we're talking about the elections, conspiracy theories, trust in the media. Dan, thanks again for being here today. I want to pick up where we left off in that last second about media bias, and some of your findings with the conspiracy theory work showed that people are going out there and not trusting the media, so getting into the wild internet side of things and finding some of this stuff. But concerns about biased media is not new. And to me, the emergence of cable news in the last few decades have allowed viewers to sort of self-select where they get their news from. And that's only exploded since Fox News and MSNBC and others have come on. But for the most part, I think journalists are individually trying to tell the story and the facts they're finding. And really, it's when we get to the opinion side of news, the Maddows or the Tucker Carlsons, et cetera. But tell us what you're finding. Where are people right now in terms of trust in the media and where they're getting their sources of information?
Yeah, I perhaps not surprisingly have a lot of thoughts about this. We work very closely with a lot of journalists who I respect immensely, who have a very difficult job, having to turn around things very quickly, working in an environment where the political news is kind of unrelenting. But I do think, there are a few problems. As a society, I think we are constantly overvaluing elite opinion, whether it's in the form of journalists on Twitter or influencer culture or politicians trying to create their own brands. I mean, the very idea that a news outlet, pay people to share their opinions, this idea of opinion journalism seems kind of crazy to me, and, I'm not going to make a lot of friends on the opinion pages with an attitude like that, but, and these are very smart people, but it's what they're writing.
It's true. The ones who make millions of dollars are not chasing down sources in the halls of Congress or sitting in a White House briefing room. It's the 9 p.m., 10 p.m. kind of talk show slot that they get.
Right. I mean, it's anecdotal, it's impressionistic, it's filtered through an ideological lens for the most part. And so much of our debate has become elites talking to other elites, and it's really divorced from the wider experiences of the public. I think it would be awesome if a show had just like an average person coming on and just talking for 10 minutes about what their life was like every week. That would be really cool. And I think that's what a lot of public opinion research strives to be and could be, right? When so much of the media and political landscape has become persona driven, the kind of public facing fact driven research that we do is really kind of the antithesis of that.
Yeah, and I'm curious too. I find that a lot of journalism has become persona driven on the other side of that as well, that we chase politicians and others, not for their policies, but for their latest hot take on what Trump said on Twitter or what Nancy Pelosi said on a conference call. And that has become such a larger share of our news that we've gotten away from some of what you were talking about in the first segment, those policy discussions about different views. How much is that impacting our media environment as well?
I mean, yeah, immensely. I think if you look at Trump and a lot of Trump supporters, I think that a lot of supporters would have no idea where he stands on a whole variety of issues. And it's become about identity and, what he stands for. And I think when we think about so much of the animating force in our politics now is about demographic change, right? That we are shifting rapidly, and you hear this a lot about sort of the racial and ethnic composition in the U.S., but it's religion too. Religion is absolutely a core part of this. We're now a quarter of the country has no formal religion. The white Christian population, which used to be dominant, is now I think around 50%. And there's a vibrant and growing groups of non-Christian communities in the U.S. that are becoming more visible, or culturally and politically. And so I think sort of navigating that is challenging for any society. And I think we haven't done it particularly well. And I think some of our political leaders have done a kind of a disservice to sort of helping us try to feel integrated and connected, but rather sort of use these sort of shifts as a way to sort of separate us into camps. And this is happening both on the left and the right. And it's really unfortunate because it really creates an environment that it becomes difficult to want to work together. It's so not even that, we can identify the same problems, whether it's climate change or income inequality or whatever it is, but we dislike each other so much. This thing called affective polarization, where it's not just I disagree with you about issues, whether it's abortion or same-sex marriage. It's I fundamentally don't like you because you're a Republican or a Democrat. And in a recent poll that we did, we found that the number of Democrats and Republicans who think that the other party is not only offering different ideas that think are wrong, but is a threat to the U.S. has increased dramatically over the last 5 years. And again, some of this is about Trump sort of elevating the threat level. But I think, particularly when you look at, and again, I think it's asymmetric here that you see on the right, where there's this kind of language that is being used, sort of saying this is sort of the end of the world. We've got to sort of fight back against Democrats and liberals, whether it's on sort of religious freedom or free speech issues. I think you do see the kind of apocalyptic language employed more. Now, increasingly, you're actually seeing it on the left too. But I think the history in sort of the 90s and 2000s, it was more on the right. And, as it becomes sort of more acceptable on the left too, that really is going to take us to a place that is not good.
Yeah, that's one of my biggest worries, that we can put a lot of it at Trump's feet, but there's a responsibility of everybody. And, there will be a time when Trump's not here, and, Biden and others may try to walk that back, to be the president for all Americans. But if the rest of our political parties don't follow suit, I'm afraid the line's been moved so far that we'll never get back to a civil conversation on it.
There's also some new research that sort of informed some of what we're saying here by Liliana Mason, where she looks at identity and sort of the convergence of identities. So at a time, there was a time when if I knew your political party, I wouldn't know much about any of your personal attributes, your race, religion. But now if I know your race and religion, I can predict pretty accurately your politics. And that didn't used to be the case, but now we have this alignment of racial identity and religious identity and political identity that makes it really difficult. And it creates like really high boundaries between the political groups that can make it difficult to sort of traverse them.
Is this related to sort of the death of the independent voter? There's no such thing. I mean, we talked a lot this summer on some of our podcasts that there were no undecided voters. They may tell a pollster they're undecided, but there was really such a small number where, you think back to the 2000 elections or elections in the 90s, there were, huge chunks of independent, undecided voters that the two candidates would spend all summer and fall trying to move over into their camp.
So this is where I think I stand apart from a lot of other pollsters, and even some of the best, right? So where you have people dividing people, sort of like there's the Republicans and there's like the independents who lean Republican, and they generally, when it comes to issues, look really similar. And same thing with the independents who lean Democrat and sort of the true Democrats. And so like the Pew Research Center will group them together, and other places will group them together. But I actually don't do that, and I don't do that because while on questions of issues, those two groups look pretty similarly, the leaners and the sort of the true partisans. But on a whole other range of things that they, particularly behavior, they are different, right? So in terms of their political engagement, they have lower levels of political engagement, less likely to vote. They have lower levels of sort of civic engagement. If you look at their social networks, true partisans are much more likely to be surrounded by other partisans of the same stripe. So they have much more homogeneous political networks. So they have sort of more embedded in these kind of echo chambers than leaners. And so for a number of reasons, I kind of carve them out a little bit. But to your point, I do think there's something to be said for the fact that there's not a lot of people who are undecided, heading in down the home stretch of an election. We're sort of becoming further apart on a whole range of issues. There used to be plenty of pro-life Democrats, and there aren't anymore. Right. The number of moderate Republicans I could probably count on one hand. And so I do think that there's been kind of this ideological realignment, which has I think increased our political polarization, and one way made it kind of less difficult to vote. I think there's somewhat less hand wringing. Even if we're not thrilled with our options, we kind of know where we sit. And the only reason I think you saw some significant amounts of kind of people sort of shrugging their shoulders and ambivalence in 2016 is just that the number of people who disliked both candidates was at a record high.
Right.
That
didn't
happen
about that a lot.
Yeah, that didn't happen this year. So Biden was still viewed fairly favorably among the electorate, whereas Trump, had I think like a 40% approval rating or favorability rating.
Yeah, and I'll forget the numbers, but there was some statistic where if you disliked both candidates in 2016, which there was a big chunk, you're right, you tended to go vote for Trump. I would probably attribute that to Clinton was much more known after having spent so many years of her life in public service, where Biden won those voters significantly this time.
Right. It was more cool overall.
Right. All of that kind of leads me to a final topic I wanted to cover, which is given this polarization, given what you've found in your research and what you've learned, where is the state of the polling industry today? They were pretty criticized, probably rightly so, after 16. They were immediately criticized after the election this year, although I think as numbers continue to come in and be finalized, it looks like polling was generally right on the national numbers, and just frankly had some big whiffs in states like Maine and probably North Carolina, Michigan, Florida. Where are we? What do pollsters? Well, let me ask it this way. Is there a difference between political polling and what you're doing, and what do political pollsters need to learn coming out of this cycle?
Yeah, I mean, like, far be it from me, as I don't do a lot of horse race polling to sort of give lessons to the folks who do a lot of elections.
Sure.
So a lot of our work is just looking at, behavior and attitudes on particular issues. We do polls on like community life and family life and that kind of thing. And we touch on politics, certainly. And we always find our way back there just because it's incredibly important. But we don't really get caught up in the sort of horse race polling and who's up, who's down. But I will say that it's sort of in some ways an unfair measurement of the use and the reliability of polls to sort of say, Well, we only can trust polls if they can predict the outcome of election, and there's no research methodology that is designed to predict human behavior. If you could create one that could do that, you would be incredibly wealthy, because you could do like almost anything. But it turns out that humans are really difficult to predict and understand their behavior. So I think that there's the yardstick we're using to assess the usefulness of polling is totally off base. So when you hear things about, oh, polling, we can't trust polling anymore, what these horse race polls are actually trying to do, or what people are using them for, they're trying to predict an act, right? So how I'm going to vote, and then the subpopulation of adults in the U.S. who are going to be voting, right? So there's two things that they're trying to do there, both of which are very difficult to do. And yet the polling actually, in some cases, is in certain circumstances, under certain situations, it can be fairly accurate. So you saw some pretty accurate polls in places like Nevada. I think Georgia was pretty accurate as well. And nationally, I think the numbers will be all right. But as you said, there were some big whiffs. And one of the things I think that people are really kind of hung up on is that there was systematic bias in the polls in 2016 and 2020 in the same direction, right? Both of them overstated Democratic performance. And so I think that is something that there sort of needs to be a reassessment. And I have a piece coming out in 538 next week that tries to dig under a little bit, what's going on. And basically the thesis I have is that we're seeing an increasing number of people who are kind of socially and civically disconnected from society. And there's always been this group that's been kind of, sort of at the margins. But now their politics has shifted sharply rightward, at least in the Trump era. We don't know what will happen sort of in the post-Trump years, but these folks, particularly white Americans, but all Americans, were disproportionately supportive of Trump. And so I think a lot of the polling missed these folks, because there's been a ton of research that
and miss them how? Like can't reach them, or they wouldn't participate? Okay.
Yeah, these folks are just disinclined to participate in surveys. Again, they're disinclined to do a lot of things, right? They're not connected to sort of civic and social organizations. In our work, they had much smaller, actually no sort of immediate people in their sort of core social networks.
Right.
And so they look really different than a lot of folks. And so
is it a, going a little full circle here, is it an institutional trust thing? They don't trust
it's related
pollsters or the cold call that they're getting and click.
Yeah, it's absolutely related to that. And so, in the past, these people were still around, but they weren't dividing their votes in the same way. And so the thing to remember is, like, if this group is biased in a particular direction, right, so that they're more pro-Trump, then I'm trying to predict Trump vote, I'm going to be in trouble. But if for instance, I'm trying to look at the religious attendance or religious identity in polls, and these folks don't look any different religiously, then I'm fine. And then the estimates are not going to be biased, and we don't have a huge problem. And point of fact, like, one of the big differences between the work that I do and some of the election polling is that we're not trying to predict a subset of the population who are voters, people who will be voting in this election, which at best is like 2/3 of the adult population. We're trying to get a sense of what people are doing right now, kind of get a snapshot in time of their behaviors, their attitudes, sort of their feelings, and sort of say, this is what we found on this group of people we polled. And for a lot of that work, there's no indication that there's any major issues. Now, we always want to be kind of transparent and be kicking the tires on this stuff. But one question I have for anyone who's saying we can't trust polling is, what is the alternative? Are we going to rely on rally size? Is it political endorsements?
It's more about using polling for what it is. It's
Twitter followers, what are we going to use that's going to be more reliable? And the answer is there is nothing. And so I think I mentioned this in this piece I published this week that we should be transparent about the way we're doing things, and then reporters have a responsibility too to use other benchmarks and metrics and sort of put things in context. And I tell this when I talk to student groups all the time, don't ever look at any poll by itself as sort of the arbiter of truth. And like, this is going to tell you what's going on. You look at it in the context of everything else out there. And in 2020, the problem was that, by and large, we were seeing the same systematic error across a number of different polls.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, I think we need to leave it there, but it's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope to have you on again soon. Before we go, can you preview anything for us? What other work do you guys have coming up at the Survey Center on American Life?
Yeah, we have 3 projects, or I guess maybe even 4 projects that I'm really excited about. We have a post-election poll coming out, and that'll get at some of just what happened, but we're also looking ahead at COVID and trying to get a sense of where we are right now with this sort of huge spike nationally in infections. So that'll be interesting. We're actually looking at the relationship between masculinity and vote choice and mask wearing and all these different kind of political and non-political behaviors.
Sadly, a big issue, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and something that we looked around, there's not a lot of data. There's a lot of people talking about it and speculating about it, but not a lot of data out there. We're going to do a poll on technology and privacy. That'll be in 2021. And then we have a big survey on sort of community life in the COVID and post-COVID era, trying to get a sense of where we'll be. And this will also be in 2021.
Great. Well, I hope you'll come back and join us and talk about those when they come out. This has been a great conversation. So thanks for joining us.
We'll have to have beers next time.
Yes. Always
schedule it later in the day.
Right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of HPS Insights. Special thanks to our guest today, Dan Cox. Check out his work at AEI and the Survey Center on American Life. And you can find out more about Hamilton Place Strategies work in our podcast at hamiltonplacestrategies.com or by following us on Twitter at HPS Insight. I'm your host, Bryan DeAngelis. As always, thanks for listening to HPS Insights.
Thank you for listening to the HPS Insights podcast, produced by Hamilton Place Strategies. For the latest updates, follow us on Twitter at HPS Insight and visit us on the web at hamiltonplacestrategies.com.